All right, guys, here it is. Load number 2. This is the 3-inch, ounce and 5/8 nickel plated lead turkey load. So this is in this, small series here. So we went over an ounce and 7/8 last time, using the Tom Roster's advanced lead and bismuth shot manual. So I'm looking at an ounce and 5/8, which is probably pretty small for a lot of folks. Honestly, you could probably fit that in 2 3/4 inch hole, depending on what wad you're using, components, etc. But this wad is straight out of this manual, and I make an exception for this case, and I'll go over that once we start loading. So let's get started here. So the first thing that you'll need for this load is I'm using some Winchester. These are old Expert Snow Goose 3-inch hulls. These have very minimal internal capacity, and in fact, I'd actually say there's probably some potential 2 3/4 inch holes that are approaching the internal volume of these Winchester hulls. And I know it sounds crazy, but he actually calls for a federal hull, 3-inch hull, and I'm telling you right now, not even close. It looks like it would need a gas seal underneath. I don't think I'm missing anything in the manual. I don't see any call outs for that, so maybe I'm making a mistake, but I don't think so. So the second part that you'll need is the Winchester 209 or Cheddite CX2000 primers. Next thing is Hodgdon long shot. You're going to need 28 grains. TUPRW123 wad. It's a pretty common wad. These are actually the old Mech series wads back, I think, from Steel Shop. It even became a thing in the 80s. And I believe they just probably bought the rights and all that. And so they've been making them for a while. Get these at Precision Reloading. These are a 3-inch, ounce and a quarter steel shot wad. So you'll need those. Your choice of lead. I don't care what you load in there. I'm running some 5.5 nickel plated lead. They're running a little bit closer to 6s. And then I also have some 4.5 nickel plated lead here that is probably running a little bit closer to 5, but not quite. You will need, he's telling you 29 grains of PSB. I'm actually finding more like 25 grains is what you need. And then I'm topping it off with a Tyvek overshot card. You don't have to use these. You could use a regular overshot card if you wanted. I don't think you need one, but I did miss one key ingredient here. I'm using a 28 gauge felt spacer 1/4 inch on the bottom to lift the stack height. So you actually, he calls for, I think it's 1/8 of an inch of 20 gauge. I don't have any 20 gauge at the moment. These are perfectly fine. It gets you a stack height right where you want. So I'm using a 2.2 cc scoop, and that gets me about 28 grains of long shot. And then I'll just add a little bit to it to make it 28. So we got our 28 grain charge, and we're going to move over to the press we'll be loading these on. So once again, I had to harness my inner Mac David here to make these loads. So the beauty of these Lee load alls is, the setup is all kind of in feel. So you don't need to keep setting machines up time and time again. It's kind of the beauty of these. At the same time, it might hurt you a little bit on the consistency side. But at the end of the day, these get people into reloading, and they still have a place in my reloading setup, even though they might not get used as frequently. And that's kind of the beauty of these, is that I can go and do some load development videos, things like this, without having to worry about changing over my machine all the time. So as most of you know, I've went to a Ponsness Warren 375 that I'm running 20 gauge and 12 gauge, and I just don't want to flip the head. So anyways, just put the sizing ring on the hole. You center it up. You just size the hole. It pops the primer out. I showed in my last video, and it's probably something worth mentioning. Here's my little 3D printed primer trays. And these are much nicer than having to go in there with a vacuum cleaner or something like that and clean up the primers. So we got our primer in place. We pull the hull out. These Winchesters have really tight primer pockets, so they can be a little bit of a bugger to get out. So we pop the sizing ring off, seat the primer. So these are really high base wad. I'll bet you can find a 2 3/4 inch to do the same task as this 3-inch hole here. All right, so let's head back over to the other reloading bench. So we're going to take our 28 grain charge of Hodgdon's long shot. It doesn't take up very much room, by the way. We'll grab one of our TUPRW 123 wads. Going to grab 1/4 inch precision reloading 28 gauge felt. Stick that in the base. I get my precision reloading wad tamper. So you can see that's like the perfect height. And these Winchester, I don't know, there's something about this plastic. They don't hold a lot of memory, but man, do they crimp nice. So it almost feels like AA plastic, actually. So we're looking for 710 grains of this nickel-plated lead. So we got 711 grains. Close enough for government work. Going to just dump that in. You can see the height is pretty much perfect. And then this is a 3.4 cc scoop. If you leave it a little bit low, you'll see I'm getting about 29 grains. So what I do is just dump most of it in. And so I'm putting about 25 grains in right now. That's where I'm at the moment. I got my old toothbrush and I'm settling the buffer. And this takes a little bit longer because you're doing it in much smaller shot. If this was number 4s or 3s or 2s or something, the buffer settles real easy, but it's much more challenging to settle buffer with these smaller pellets. So I'm going to grab one of these Tyvek overshot cards, and all these really help with, they don't do much for the crimp, but they do help keep the buffer in. But you could also use sealant. You could use a overshot card, a standard overshot card, like I have here. You could use these if you wanted, cut your own, whatever. You will get a little bit of buffer leakage. So let's head over to the press and close this one up. So once again, 6-point crimp and the lead load all's in the back. You want the point of the crimp facing you. So we're closing up this 6-point crimp. You don't need to go berserk here. These 3-inch holes, it's a pretty decent pre-crimp. And then we'll close this guy up. You don't need to go crazy at first, spin it a little bit, kind of try to distribute that crimp pretty evenly if you can. So that is off of a Lee load-all, but we're gonna do one more thing and just make it look perfect. So let's head over to the drill press. All right, so we have the Gape BN3 using the Ballistic Products Hall vise. This is the same setup I always use, guys. Doesn't matter if it's 20 gauge, 10 gauge, 12 gauge, whatever. I do the same thing. And I don't do it that it cams over. I just simply hold pressure to hold the hole in place. So let's get to crimping. Alright, that's it. Let's get over to the bench and close this out. So this is it. This is the 1 5/8 nickel plated lead. I'm also going to make a couple with the 4.5 nickel plated, see how that goes. Although I suspect that the pellet count just won't be good enough. You're going to want smaller pellets because of this it being an 1 5/8 load. Technically, you know, maybe even 6s would be better, but that's completely up to you. But you can tell the Lee load-all does a half decent job. I think it's acceptable enough. You know, I could always put my taper crimp that I got from the gentleman in the Ukraine to try to get, you know, a little bit of a taper on these, but the BN3 is perfect. I mean, look at the taper on that. That would feed in even the junkiest of shotguns, I'd guess. So it does a pretty good job, but you know, this is all by feel. So, you know, you definitely make mistakes until you get it figured out. Don't get too hung up on substituting hulls or anything like that. You know, sometimes I think people do. Straight wall's really straight wall. It's internal capacity. You know, follow the recipes, but at the end of the day, had I followed the Federal, I would have needed some sort of gas seal underneath to get everything up. The long shot powder just isn't dense. So, you know, I'll be coming out with a video here hopefully in a couple weeks going over the patterns of the 10 gauge that I made and both the 12 gauge 1 7/8 and 1 5/8, and then these 2 different pellet sizes for the 12 gauge, because I really think, you know, there's the 2 sides of the aisle, you know, where people are falling on big payloads, sometimes big pellets, and then sometimes the smaller payloads, smaller pellets. So, you know, we'll see for ourselves what it looks like on paper when it comes to making a turkey load. But generally speaking, I'm actually not that big on the pellet size myself. I mean, anybody that's seen any of my waterfowl hunting videos, you know, kind of realizes the biggest pellets that I load in steel is B shot, and I don't load all that much of that. So, anyways, that's going to close out the video, and I'll see you guys in a couple weeks when it comes to the patterns. Thanks for watching.